Computex this year, Kit Guru visited a number of companies including Sharkoon, and they were keen to show us their Rebel C50 RGB case. And during our Computex coverage I said this. The Rebel C50, this is the RGB version, selling for €109. You can see the RGB through the mesh front. This is the hero product from Sharkoon at a very reasonable price. So there you have it, a hero product. This case has got a high standard to meet, so let's see how it does in this review. The Rebel C50 comes in 4 versions. This is the white with RGB. There's also a white non-RGB, a black with RGB, a black with non-RGB. We'll come to pricing shortly. Let's pull off some panels first and take a look around. The main glass simply pops free. It's clear. And the back panel, which is heavily perforated, also pops off. Front panel, loads of mesh, bit of a pull, and away it comes. The top panel, heavily perforated, is fixed in place. There is a radiator fan rack inside the top panel, but we have to remove some screws to get that out, so we'll leave that for the moment. It is clear that mesh and airflow are a major feature of the Rebel C50. And also we have 4 fans. These are RGB, 3 in the front, 1 in the rear. If you get a non-RGB case, it has 1 fan in the front, 1 in the rear. However, according to the specification, even the non-RGB versions get this RGB fan hub, so they are ready for an RGB upgrade. And with some power applied, we can see the fans in action. Obviously, I don't have the RGB connection to the motherboard as yet. There is no motherboard. We are using the hardware function in the top of the case. These fans have a regular ARGB header, there's no proprietary connector, and we get a reasonable selection of light patterns. You will note the RGB lighting is only in the hub of the fan, and by my count there are 8 LEDs per fan, so they are relatively basic, but we have RGB and we have PWM control. Of course, there is the outside chance that you can't stand RGB. So how about static white? Obviously you could disable the RGB altogether, but in that case you might just as well buy the cheaper case in the first place. And that brings us neatly to pricing. Here in the UK, distribution for Sharkoon is a bit patchy, so we're using prices from Amazon. The basic Rebel C50 in black without RGB, so it has 2 fans, is £91 plus delivery. The black version with 4 RGB fans sells for £100. The white non-RGB model is £114. And the white with 4 RGB fans is £121. As an aesthetic observation, the fans have black frames even though this is a white case. They also have black cables. They don't look particularly tidy. And just for clarity, I've replaced the twisty ties that come with the case for stock with some cable ties just to keep things a little bit neat and tidy when I was kicking off this video. So the cables, not the greatest look. Cooling. We've got 3 fans in the front, 1 fan in the rear. We can install either 3 120s or 2 140s in the roof, and we can open up the side position and install 3 120s. That's a lot of fans. We've got more going on, however, around the back. This plate is for mounting drives, either 3 hard drives or 3 SATA SSDs, or a 120mm fan in the rear taking up one of the drive positions. Why would you want a fan behind your motherboard tray? You might want to keep those hard drives cool. That's not really a very likely reason to me. More likely is you have a motherboard that has a CPU that can get hot around the CPU socket. Some Intel high-end desktops did that, so that might be a reasonable approach. Let us take a look at this top radiator fan rack. As I say, the top panel is fixed, so you have to unscrew the rack. Should have thought ahead, shouldn't I? The 4th screw is behind that drive mount, so let's take that out. now we can get to this fourth screw up there. I think that is the most fiddly and annoying process for a top radiator fan rack I have ever seen. Normally these sorts of racks will slide out, or alternatively it could be fixed in place and the top panel pops loose. This approach is really strange. Also, we've been sent a drawing, a really basic drawing of a revised top fan rack, which is going to make it easier to shift your cooling away from the back panel and give you more space away from your RAM. We don't have the actual part, we just have a little diagram, but the principle makes sense to us. Before I open up the side location for cooling, I'm just going to point out we have a GPU support here. Couple of thumb screws around the back. Quite simple, horizontal GPU, sagging at the end, and now it's supported. One screw, two, and four. And that's the fifth and final screw. And now if you choose, you can install 3 fans in the side location. But wait, you say, surely this is in the way. Yup, the front of the power supply shroud can indeed be removed to fully open the side location. That's the front of the power supply shroud removed, and the side location is fully open. So you could, if you choose, install 3 fans in the side or a 360 cooler. Indeed, you could put a liquid cooler in the roof of the case without any difficulty. The user manual says no liquid cooler in the front. It doesn't say you can't, it just tells you can put it in the roof or the side. The explanation is the fans at the front are secured by screws that go into female threads in the case. So mounting a radiator on the inside of the frame is effectively impossible. With the case fully dismantled, we can see the layout is fairly conventional. The front I/O is actually on the top, which is the standard practice these days. 2 USB Type A, 1 Type C, and we have the power button plus also the RGB control function and a headset jack. I think we're ready to start building a PC. For the hardware, I'm starting with this Gigabyte Z790 Aorus Pro X. This is one of Gigabyte's refreshed Z790 motherboards, which go with Intel 14th gen processors. Z790 obviously suggests it's not a radical overhaul, and indeed the 14th gen processors are not a radical overhaul, more of a tickle than a major update. As you can see, the motherboard has a black and white colour scheme going on, which is a perfect match to the Sharkoon case. It has a mighty VRM, loads of aluminium heat sinks, and should work absolutely admirably inside this case. Also, this is an ATX motherboard rather than eATX. The case supports ATX. For the memory, I'm going with 32 gigabytes of G.Skill Trident Z5 RGB, DDR5 6000. And the power supply is this Seasonic Focus GX1000. It's ATX3, 1000 watts, as the name suggests, and gold rated. Recently reviewed on kitguru.net, and we like this power supply hugely. That's the hardware at the heart of the system. We'll come to the CPU cooler and the graphics card later. Step 1 is to install the Intel Core i5-14600K. Then we reach for the G.Skill Trident Z5 RGB and snap it into place. And that looks the part. And now we have the SSD. I'm using a Sabrent Rocket 4.0. Off with the heatsink from the Gigabyte motherboard, which is a simple tool-free release. Remember to remove the protective plastic from the thermal pad. Snick the SSD into place, also tool-free. Check it's good and properly home. Off with the rather obvious protective plastic. And we're ready to install the motherboard in the Sharkoon case. The motherboard assembly is installed and it looks the part, so that's good news. In terms of the accessories you get with this case, we've got one of those little plug-in speakers that you can connect to one of the headers on the foot of the board. We have some replacement plastic clips for these various pop connectors, just the two of those. We've got a fan extension cable that's not exactly a Y cable. Let's have a quick look and see what form it is. I mean, it's for connecting 3 fans at the front to one header on the motherboard is what it is, but it's not quite a Y cable. However, it does seem entirely appropriate to the case, so that's good. We have some cable ties and a selection of grommets which fit into the various holes in the drive plate, so we can install either SSDs or hard drives as we see fit. And then we have a nice touch that probably costs pennies to the manufacturer. The screws for drives and the motherboard are supplied in little sealed bags, and you also get a resealable bag that is printed, so 12 screws for HDD, 5 pieces for PSU, 12 for SSD, and 13 for motherboard. I've used 9, I've got 4 remaining. Do they really think I'm going to lose 4 screws? Perhaps. Also in the accessories we have a number of Sharkoon branded Velcro straps. As you can see, I've installed 3 just to keep the cables under control. So motherboard assembly installed. You will note we have plenty of access to the back of the CPU socket, so you should have no trouble installing whichever CPU cooler you require with this case. Next up, I think I'm going to reinstall the top fan rack. I suppose I could just park it actually if I'm not going to use it. Now that's a dilemma. I'm reviewing the case as supplied, but if I'm not going to install fans or a cooler in the top, because I'm going to use the side position, let's leave it out. It's going to help airflow, I imagine. Okay then, next up we have the Seasonic Focus GX1000 power supply. I can see why Alan gave this Seasonic Focus GX1000 such a rave review. So it's a Focus rather than the Prime, which makes it a mainstream product, and it's gold rated rather than platinum or titanium, but you still get a fully modular design. You get 12 volt high power. The cables are an individual stranded design rather than the old licorice style, and 1000 watts should power most gaming PCs. Yeah, I like that. The case has a bracket on the back which can be removed to give you easy access. We'll mount the power supply with the fan down so it can draw air in through the filtered bottom. Install the screws. And now we have a few cables to connect. There we go, nice and tidy. While we're at it, it's worth pointing out the Focus GX1000 has a warranty that lasts for 10 years, which is pretty bloomin' epic. For the CPU cooler, I'm going to use this NZXT Kraken Elite 360. 360mm RGB, white with a bit of black. I had to make the decision about whether to have the fans in intake or exhaust. I've gone for intake, so we're looking at the back of the fans. The logic there being, if these were in exhaust, then as soon as the air comes in the front, it goes out of the side, and that won't help the graphics card. So we'll see how that works in practice, but I have every confidence that'll be fine. With the Kraken Elite 360 RGB installed, we have quite a lot of cables around the back, but it's under control. In the main compartment, it's all looking rather good. For the graphics card, I'm going for this Gigabyte GeForce RTX 4080 Gaming OC. It's an enormous graphics card, however when we install it horizontally in the usual styling, it goes in with a reasonable amount of space to spare, and we have a small amount of clearance to that side-mounted 360mm AIO cooler. So that is a perfectly reasonable approach. However, Sharkoon also sent us this vertical riser, which is specifically for the C50 case. It's PCI Express Gen 4. And the idea, of course, is we're going to put our graphics card in that location there. I think it's worth trying this out and just see which approach we prefer. The instructions tell us to install the graphics card on the bracket and then slide the assembly into place. So this isn't doing things correctly, this is just so we can take a look at the hardware, and it looks absolutely fine. So I'm going to have a bit of fiddling around off camera to put the graphics card in, and then we'll see whether or not we're ready to fire up our brand new shiny PC. I like it. I'm going with a vertical GPU. So we need to factor in £45 for that PCI Express Gen 4 riser. Around the back, I am not going to install this drive plate, although I could. There is space. I have to say, the idea of having 1, 2, 3 3.5-inch hard drives behind that drive plate, behind the motherboard, I really don't much like that idea. It would be plausible to install SSDs there. I wouldn't be too concerned about heat. The idea of hanging a fan behind the motherboard tray, that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So I'm going to leave all this hardware out of the equation. And I think it's time to get on and start up the PC. With the PC running, we first took a look at the RGB lighting, which was very appealing, and then we moved on to thermal testing. We started with all the fans running at 1000 RPM. Running a combination of Cinebench R23 and Speedway stress test, the PC was drawing 605 watts at the wall socket. That sounded like this. It's a chilly 18 degrees here today, and the temperatures were perfectly respectable. 77 for the CPU, 70 for the GPU. Ramping up the fan speeds, so now the AIO fans are running at 1100 RPM and the case fans flat out at 1500 RPM. That sounded like this. The CPU temperature dropped to 74 and the GPU to 68. For our third test, we ran all the fans flat out. The AIO fans now at 1800 RPM, the case fan still at 1500 RPM, and that sounded like this. The CPU temperature dropped to an impressive 68 and the GPU to 66. To my surprise, this video has gone on rather longer than I expected. It turns out there's quite a lot to show with this Sharkoon Rebel C50 RGB. So let's wrap it up with my conclusions. Pros, the good points: stylish and clean looks. Secondly, the side panels pop off very easily. Third, you get 4 120mm ARGB fans included in the price. And fourth, you get the ARGB fan hub, but you also get hardware control for the RGB lighting, so you don't need to use motherboard software. Cons, the negative points: the radiator fan rack that goes in the roof of the case is awkward to work with, and both to remove and to install. Second, if you open up the side of the case, as I have, you lose that horizontal GPU support. Third, the ARGB fans are rather basic. Overall, I'm going to give the Sharkoon Rebel C50 RGB a worth considering award.